Phil.
John.
So, great to talk to you. Thanks for inviting us in. I thought it would be good to start talking about the thing that kind of drives you as a musician, the thing you know grew up doing, playing the drums. I thought maybe if you could tell us a little bit of why you became a drummer and what was it about drumming that you loved so much?
Well, I can't really, I can't remember why it was drums. I think it was, when you were growing up in the 50s, which is hard to sort of understand probably now if you're a kid growing up in this era, but back then, you got a soldier, a toy, and in my instance, I got a toy drum, and I can remember, I was only 3, I think, but I can remember, my kind of shutter went off when I got this drum. I can remember the instance, a lot of infant stuff you forget, obviously, over the years, but I can remember this incident, and I was given a drum by my uncles, sort of family uncles, they weren't really uncles, and apparently I took to it, but I probably, only given 3 or 4 Christmas presents, you played with them properly, as opposed to getting a Star Wars set or something. So I played with it, and then a couple of years later, I had taken to it so much that my uncles made me a drum kit, which fitted in a suitcase, a couple of crisscross bits of wood, and poles sticking out with the little cymbals and tambourines and stuff. And I used to sit in the living room and play this along to the television. And so somewhere in there, the bug was taken. The bug was, it was kind of extraordinary. Pop music as such, the Beatles had yet to start. So it was all, my sister was a big record listener, Neil Sedaka and Tommy Steele. My brother was a Jim Reeves fan. But there was music one way or the other in the house. And I was, actually, my mum and dad used to belong to a boat club on the Thames in Twickenham. Which, all those years later I'm kind of honorary president of. But they used to, they were at the beginning of this yacht club. And I used to play at the shows on the drums. And there is some footage of that. How old were
you then? Like sort of 10?
I was probably 9 or 10. Yeah, because when I was 12, maybe I was 12, because I had a proper drum kit when I was 12. I think I'd taken to it so much that when it came to my birthday, I sold my brother's train set. I found out, I thought it was my train set, but he replied, he reminded me that it was his train set. So
he probably reminded you in no uncertain terms.
Well, yeah, he only came up about 15 years ago. He said, we were in the pool at my house, in Switzerland when I used to have a swimming pool, and he said, that that train set you keep talking about? I said, yeah. He said, that was mine, it wasn't yours. But I was the one at that point that was playing with it, so I considered it mine. But I made the ultimate sacrifice and sold that, and my mum put the rest. So I bought my first drum kit, and that is the drum kit that's in this footage. So I must have been 12, not even 13, I don't think. So it's always been there, from the age of 5, seriously, to the age of 12, getting a proper drum kit, and then playing in my school bands, at drama school, which I joined when I was 13, 14. Used to play all Motown stuff and Otis Redding stuff. I used to sing a bit from behind the drums. We had a singer as well. Backing singers, It was so it's always been kind of in my life.
Did you did you develop a kind of, consciously develop a drumming style, or did you take the style from the particular genre, like, you know, if it's Motown, you kind of listen to the Motown records and play like that?
I tried to play like that, yeah. I mean, I was left-handed, and so straight away that kind of, you know, I remember, I didn't set it up the way other drummers set it up. I set it up what was comfortable for me, which was exactly a mirror image of the right-handed drum kit. And I just picked it up. I mean, I guess because I listened to all kinds of music. I mean, by 1966, I was 15, I was listening to Buddy Rich and the big bands, you know, and John Coltrane and people, which is kind of advanced for a 15-year-old back then. I mean, now it's maybe not so much of a stretch, but I was definitely listening to all kinds of music. I was a Beatles fan rather than a Stones fan, although I did buy both albums, you know, both the group's albums. And I listened to all the stuff of the pop music of the day, you know, the Kinks and the Yardbirds and the Animals and the Who. So, and I tended to sort of play like, I learned to play listening to records. So if it was a Who record, I would be playing like Keith Moon. And if it was Kinks record, I'd be playing like Mick Avery, you know, or if it was the Hollies, I'd be playing like Bobby Elliott. I kind of worshipped all the drummers in the band, in the different bands. And so I guess, and the reason I mention that is because there was never particularly necessarily one drummer that I kind of set out to copy, and the styles of music were very different. And I think in later life that stood me in good stead, because I could actually play in a lot of different styles. And even inside Genesis, for example, if we had a song that was kind of heavy, I'd put on a John Bonham hat. If there was something that was a little out there, a bit crazier, and I was able to, I would put on a Keith Moon hat. You know, if it was a straight ahead song, I'd put on a Ringo hat. You know, and it was still sounding like me, I think, but it was just like that's the approach that I had, kind of a bit of a chameleon, you know.
It sounds like you were pretty confident quite early that you could be a professional drummer.
That was really all I wanted to do. I mean, I didn't have. Again, we have to remember the era that we're talking about. I mean, pop music was in its early stages. You know, I mean, you had Elvis Presley and Bill Haley, and Tommy Steele, I suppose, for the English. You know, he was a big pop star, but it wasn't really a profession. I mean, it wasn't a business like it became. And when I was 14, I remember thinking, you know, the whole thing through. I went to drum lessons at a shop in Acton, and to learn to read music, because I thought if I'm going to do this for a living, I need to learn to read drum music. I went to piano lessons because my aunt was a piano teacher, and she taught me piano, but taught me to read piano music. But I had really good ears. You know, I'd grown up listening to music and learning music by ears, by listening, rather than by music. So she got very frustrated. I mean, she'd be teaching me something with music in front of me on a Saturday morning. I used to go. And she'd say, you're not reading it, are you? You're playing it, but you're not reading it. You're remembering it. And I said, yeah, I can't help it. You know, you've told me what to play, and I'm remembering it. And that, again, proved to be an advantage later in life, because, you know, you only had to sing something to me once, and I would be able to remember it. So my piano reading kind of ground to a halt. Same thing with the drum music, because as soon as the drum teacher would play it, I'd say, okay, I can play that, but I can't read it. So, but I'd kind of mapped out my whole life. I mean, I was desperately trying hard to concentrate on learning to read drum music, because if I wanted to do sessions and I wanted to, you know, I'd grown up At 14 I was in Oliver in the West End, you know, and I used to go home on the train at the same time as the musicians in the orchestra, and I'd got to know them, you know, 7 months playing the part of the Artful Dodger, and I knew the drummer in the band, I knew a couple of the other guys. We all got the train home and got off at various stops. But that was what, if I wanted to make drums a profession, then I knew that I had to read, because this is probably where my life would end up, in an orchestra pit. And if, you know, earlier than that, it would be in a dance band, like the Ray McVeigh dance band, which I saw advertised everywhere, you know, playing dance band music, which I guess in a way I did later in life with my big band. And I didn't read music, you know, when I did that. I had to invent my own kind of music. You know, forward line if it was a push, or a backward line if it was after a beat, you know, it was like phonetics. And I kind of, you know, managed to do that in my own way, but I wish I had learned to play, to read drum music. But that was, yeah, I was confident enough to know that this was going to be my vocation.
And jumping from that to, I don't know, 18, 19, you were kind of beginning to be semi-professional or even professional. I don't know at that point where you got your was it with your friend Carlisle?
Ronnie,
exactly.
Ronnie Parrow, yeah.
But at that point, were you kind of, can you think back to how you were feeling about, oh, is this it? Is this my future? Is this what I want?
Because my mum was working for, you know, she was an agent, a theatrical agent, for kids, and that was the drama school that I went to. There was a lady called Barbara Speake who had a dancing school, and my mum and her kind of got chatting one day, and Barbara wanted to start an agency for kids because commercial television had started, and so there was lots of opportunities for kids to be on adverts and pantomimes and things. So my mum, she was at a loose end, so she did that from home at first, and then eventually she did it from the drama school. But so I was sent for the part of the Artful Dodger, and I was sent for different other things, you know, different things, acting, knitting patterns, junior points of view, you know, all these kind of things. But I really desperately just wanted to play drums for a living. Now, those opportunities were very thin on the ground at that point. But of course, by the time I was 13, 14, we're talking about 63, 64, 65, then of course the pop music world was huge. Then along came, I had my school band that I was playing in, and obviously we did all these soul covers, Motown covers. I then met another guitar player from another rival stage school called Ronnie Carroll, and he and I formed this group. There's only two of us. I remember going to his place. It's just the era of the supergroup, you know, Cream, and if more than one good musician got together with another musician, then it was kind of a supergroup. So I went to his house. I walked down the road to his house in Hounslow, and I knocked on the door. He'd heard of me from his friends at school, and I'd heard of him from friends at school. And I said, you know, you Ronnie? And he said, yeah. I said, I'm Phil. And we each knew each other. And I said, do you want to form a group? He said, yeah. Who's in it? I said, me. So we formed a group. And, you know, we just used to play in our living room. And I've got great tapes of the two of us, not videotapes, but I've got audio tapes. Some really good stuff. I mean, Ronnie was very good. His mum and dad were in music. His dad was a band leader, and his mum was a singer in the band. He could play anything. And he's in my band today, you know. But we've been together ever since, on and off. And so by that point, I was ambitious because it was beginning to seem possible that you could do this for a living outside the world of, you know, reading music and dance bands and stuff. You know, you could actually, if you were lucky enough, get in a pop band that something would happen. You don't, you know, it's just a question of playing for a living. And so I was ambitious when it came to that, and confident without being arrogant that it was possible. You know, I was good enough to do it. I never had a day job. I never had a normal job.
You were the trailblazer, in a sense.
Well, I don't know about that, but I do remember that the first job I ever got, well, the only job I ever got, which was kind of anywhere near normal, was when I joined Genesis, funnily enough. The guys, I went to the audition and got the job eventually, and they said, well, before we start this mammoth, you know, job of teaching you, of learning how to play as a four-piece, because our guitar player's left, Anthony Phillips, we're going to go on holiday for 2 weeks. We thought we were going to get a brain break for 2 weeks. And I said, great, I've got the job, but what am I going to do for money for the next 2 weeks? Because, you know, literally I didn't have anything. And so my girlfriend at the time, her father did exterior decorating, you know, painting houses and stuff. And I did that for 2 weeks, and I hated it. I mean, I had no patience for stripping down, you know, stripping the paint off the windowsills. And it was very cold, I think, when it's kind of towards the end of the year. So it was getting chilly, and up at 7 in the morning to paint over, you know, and I was painting over locks, you know, on the sort of the coal sheds and things. And you know, this father, my girlfriend's father, told me that at one point, you know, he was getting calls from this house saying, you know, we can't get in the woodshed because some bloke's painted over the lock. And, you know, I was only doing it for 2 weeks, so I didn't kind of pay attention to detail. But that was the only job I ever had. Then when Genesis came back, we got together and started rehearsing and writing Nursery Crime.
So Genesis, it all started off from, you got a tip from Tony Stratton Smith, am I right? Do you want to tell us a little bit about how that happened?
Yeah, well, the way you got jobs in those days, unless you were somebody that knew somebody, was the Melody Maker, the back pages of the Melody Maker. You know, back in those days when it actually was a real good music paper. You know, it wasn't an indie cutting-edge newspaper. It reported the news about what was happening in music. And I had known Tony Stratton Smith years before in a band that I was in called The Freehold, and we used to room at a hotel in Russell Square in London, and it was quite an interesting place. We were the singer of the band, I think it was his aunt that owned it. So we always had the run of the place, and we always went there to eat. We met there to go to gigs. And Jimmy Savile lived there. Jimi Hendrix's roadies lived there. Tony Stratton Smith lived there, who was at that point a writer for the Manchester Evening News, actually. And he was kind of getting started in music. He managed the Kubas. And the Kubas and the Creation, two bands he managed, they were staying there as well. It was like a real, you know, kind of high energy place. Our manager with the Freehold was gay. He was living there. Strat wasn't gay, but he helped them out when they were busy. But Jimmy Savile, of course, we all know what Jimmy Savile was doing. It was a strange environment. But anyway, I got to know Strat very well, and he used to call me P-Lip, and we bonded. He was a lovely man. So when I saw the advert in the Melody Maker a few years later, 3 years later maybe, having met him, it said Tony Stratton Smith requires drummer sensitive to acoustic music and an acoustic guitar player, lead acoustic guitar player. So me and Ronnie, we thought, this is us, you know. So I went to the Marquee Club where I used to go religiously to see different bands, and I knew the management there, and I was part of the furniture. I went to see Strat, who I thought could be found there drinking, in the bar. And I said, I saw an advert. He said, "Oh, Philip, how are you?" I said, "Oh, all right. I was looking at that advert in the Melody Maker." And he said, "Oh, yeah, good band." I said, "Well, you know, any chance of an in, you know?" He said, "Oh, no, these guys are very fussy, very particular. I don't think, you know, I can't do much for you there. You're going to have to go to the audition." So I said, "Okay." So I rang up, made the call, and I don't know who it was I spoke to. Maybe it was Peter. But it seemed to be that he was in charge of the auditions. And the auditions were at his house, his parents' house in Chobham. And I went down in Ronnie had a Morris Minor. I packed the drums in and he put his guitar, and we went off to Surrey to do the audition. And as we were driving, you know, into Chobham, we thought, this is fantastic. This is trees, trees, countryside. It was a bit different from Hounslow, where we had the odd tree. But, yeah, so we pulled up and we were early. And I mean, I've told the audition story many times, but it was funny because, you know, when I walked in the garden to sort of say hello, followed the noise, you know, they're auditioning drummers under a big parasol in the back garden, and there was a grand piano on the patio. And Rutherford, who claims this isn't true, and we've discussed this and argued about it many times, he was in a smoking jacket. He had a kind of Noel Coward sort of burgundy smoking jacket, tied, you know, velvet. And that's how I remember him, and there's no reason why I would make it up. But he claims it's not the case. But anyway, they were auditioning drummers, and they said, "Have a swim in the pool." I thought, God, a pool and a tree, you know. So I went for a swim while Mike took Ronnie off to try the guitar stuff. And of course, I was listening to other drummers before me. I was 2 or 3 drummers before me, and by the time I got around to doing my thing, Peter said that even the way I set my drum kit up was professional. You know, they were very impressed by my manner. And of course, I knew everything that had gone before because I'd been listening to it for 45 minutes. So by the time I sat down at the drums, I was pretty familiar with the material. So I made it sound like I, you know, had a great ear, which I did have. But nevertheless, you know, some of it was a little tricky, but I managed to get around it. And I went back home, and Ronnie said to me in the car on the way back, he said, "I think you blew that." I remember him saying, "I think you blew that." "I think I did well," he said. So later on, when Peter finally called us, he called me, and I guess he called Ronnie separately, but he said, "We'd like you to join the band." And I said, "Great." I said, "What about Ronnie?" And I think he must have said something like, "Well, Ronnie didn't make it, I'm afraid." You know, he was a bit too bluesy. You know, he was listening to Clapton and the Blues Breakers and Cream, and you know, he was a bluesy guitar player. Much less so now, but then he was, and so it didn't really fit into. I could see why it didn't fit into what they were doing. Whereas I had this kind of, you know, this multi kind of different tastes and different styles of playing.
When you were listening to the other guys auditioning, did you kind of pick up on what they were doing wrong?
Yeah, yeah. Well, the first thing a couple of them did was they said, "Would you like to warm up?" You know, as one would an athlete or something. Before you jump the high jump, would you like to warm up? And the drummer said, "Yeah, all right." And so they did solos, you know, which really was it's never been in the Genesis, you know, dictionary. You know, you don't do, I mean, me and Chester did drum duets, but because it was a bit of a spectacle, you know, I mean, and something you didn't see anywhere else. But actually, the whole band leaving the stage and the drummer doing a solo just never worked with Genesis music. And I thought, that's a bit of a mistake. I said, I don't think we need to show off. So when I came up to the audition, they said, "Would you like to warm up?" I said, "No, that's all right. I just, you know, just what are we going to play?" And I think that was a tick in my direction. Peter was a drummer, and he said on many occasions that he felt that the way I set up, and I seemed to know what I was doing. The way I sat, the way I handled myself seemed to, be someone that was confident. And they were looking for someone that they didn't have to tell what to play. I think with the drummer that preceded me, they'd had quite a few drummers. I mean, Chris Stewart, Jonathan Silver, and John Mayhew was the one prior to me. And I think with John Mayhew, he wasn't a natural drummer, so the drum parts had to be kind of delegated a bit. It was a committee to get him to play stuff. That's the impression I get. And that Trespass album does not sound really like a band is as good as its drummer, in my opinion. You can have a lousy band but with a good drummer and it sounds pretty okay. You can have a great band with a lousy drummer and it's not happening.
I think Mike says in his book, Mike Rutherford, that they didn't have rhythm until you arrived.
They didn't have rhythm.
Yeah,
possibly.
That you kind of introduced rhythm in a way that they were kind of a little too held back and controlled and contained.
Yeah.
Would you think that's right?
Well, yeah, I would, based on the recorded stuff I never saw the band live, so I don't know. The recorded stuff, Genesis to Revelation and Trespass, I thought were weak rhythmically, even though there's some great possibilities on that record to be, especially Trespass, to be, ballsy and rhythmic. But anyway, that was, that's no slight on John Mayhew. We're talking about 1969, 70, so everybody was all fresh and everybody was learning. But anyway, I got the call to do the job and Ronnie didn't. And so we, after the holiday, 2-week holiday, we reconvened at the Maltings in Farnham for about 5 or 6 weeks, something like that, to write music and to learn what stuff they were going to keep going from the previous incarnation. And that album that we wrote, the material that we wrote, would later become Nursery Crime.
Did it surprise you in a way that you were kind of taken in as a complete member of the group and a co-writer right from the beginning?
Yeah, I wasn't really writing much at that time. I had bits, and some of my drum things, if you like, I might start playing something just because I'd heard it somewhere else or I'd learnt it, and the guys would start playing along to it, So in a way, I suppose some of that stuff became composition, but I wasn't really a writer. And I think, they probably felt that they had that covered. There was enough arguments without another, between Tony, Mike and Peter, who were all pretty highly strung at this point. So I think I was a kind of an example of freedom, of liberty, and they were kind of arguing. There was a lot of arguing. It wasn't all the time, but you could see there was tension.
Was it kind of civilised arguing?
Yeah, it wasn't punch-ups or anything. It was just someone would storm out, and quite often that would happen at the Maltings. And this, we were all kind of living. I was staying at Mike Rutherford's house. We were all living, not living together literally under the same roof. Although I was staying with Mike, and sometimes Peter would walk out. Sometimes Tony would walk out. Sometimes Mike would walk out. He'd hit a guitar chord and then walk out. And I'd say, what's going on? Did I miss something? And it turned out that sometimes my humour deflated a situation, and made us laugh at it.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, what did you know about Genesis and what did you think about the music before you came?
Yeah. Well, I remember saying to the guys Howard and Blakely, Ken Howard and Alan Blakely managed a group I was in called Flaming Youth. and that was in '69, I think. It wasn't the band I was in prior to Genesis, but it was very close. You know, I mean, I went through quite a few bands in that last 18 months before I joined Genesis, but we couldn't get gigs. You know, we had a very high profile album called Art 2, critically acclaimed album, actually, album of the month in Melody Maker. I mean, it was quite a charmed existence for the short time we lived. You know, it existed, but the we didn't play too much, and we were actually a pretty good live band. And I remember saying to our managers, you know, Genesis, this Quintessence, who always seemed to be on the back pages of a Melody Maker, and this band Genesis, you know, they're all playing everywhere, you know, and they were always, it was Quintessence, Genesis, playing here, there and everywhere, all over the back pages of Melody Maker. I said, why can't we get gigs? Why, you know? So I remember they made an impression on me as a hard-working band. But I'd never heard a note of the music until the day of the audition, when I went down there, and they kind of got 2 or 3 of us together before the auditions, and you know, we sat in the living room and listened to parts of Trespass, and then I had my swim, and they auditioned the drummers that were before me. But
I mean, you didn't think it's a far big distance between, say, Trespass and the Kinks, or the things that you were kind of really into, like the Beatles.
Yeah, I thought it was. Yeah, it was definitely out of the box of regular songs. You know, it didn't. There was very. They didn't seem to hold a tempo for very long. It went from section to section, you know, which was all interesting. A little strange to me, because that was not the world I was kind of used to living in. Although, one of my favourite pieces of music, which was the Buddy Rich West Side Story medley, the big band, you know, I mean, that went from tempo changes to tempo changes, and it wasn't that, actually. And Yes I was a big fan of the early Yes, and they were doing all kinds of arrangements like that. But it wasn't something that I hadn't been in a band myself that was doing that. So it kind of was a bit outside the box and very interesting. The sound of the record was kind of soft. It had a smooth edge to it, which I remember thinking that it was a little like the Crosby, Stills and Nash album that had just come out at that time, the first one, which had harmonies, and it was soft. You know, even when it was kind of playing heavy stuff, it was still soft. It wasn't edgy. So that was my first impression. But I didn't know anything about the band. I mean, I just knew that it was a working band, and as far as I was concerned, that was what I was looking for. You know, so as a writer, my strength, without a doubt, was my ability to play the drums. I did not have any kind of writing ability at that point, not that I knew of anyway.
But the writing ability kind of, it came in stages. Was Steve Hackett on board at this point?
No, they tried to find a guitar player, but they had not found one at those auditions. We then advertised again, and there was a guy that played with us for what seemed like a long time, but it's probably only a few months, called Mick Barnard. Mick Barnard or Mick Barnard? Mick Barnard.
Mick Barnard, I think.
Mick Barnard, yeah. It's a great guy. I liked him.
Is he from Aylesbury?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he joined us, and he was very good, if I remember rightly. But you know, again, it didn't seem permanent. And then one day, I think we had answered, and not we, the royal we. I think it was probably Peter or Tony, had seen an advert for a guitar player who was trying to get into a band that was outside the box, you know, and that was Steve. And he, everybody liked him.
Yeah, but you and he were kind of. I was wondering if you bonded because you weren't the the public school boys, you were both.
Yes, I suppose so. I mean, it's difficult you know, Tony, Mike, and myself, and Peter, although I don't see Peter as much as the other guys. You know, I up until recently, I was in the band with them, really. I mean, we did the reunion, and we're still staying in touch. And they, you know, I was in hospital, they came to visit me. You know, I mean, we're good pals, you know. And whereas Steve, I bump into very rarely, and I am still stuck with that memory from back then, you know. So it's difficult to know how close I was with Steve. I mean, I do feel that we were probably felt a little in our own boat because we weren't from the same background. But then, you know, I don't really remember hanging out too much with him. You know, I mean, I found his playing a little stiff, but I guess that was the Fripp influence as well. Fripp was a little bit music by numbers to some extent. I mean, I like Roberts. I played with him on his solo album, and you know, he was always very good to me. But I don't find he was a very intuitive player. He was kind of a sound man, you know, and without the feeling, if you like. And I think Steve took a little bit of that into his music. It wasn't a groove, you know, and as a drummer, that was really where I lived. If it didn't have, you know, sometimes I felt like I was swimming against the tide to get something with a real groove to it. And I think probably, I mean, Tony and Mike, obviously their playing has changed drastically since the early days of the band, but in the early days, it was a band without a groove, frankly, and I did my best. But some of the later stuff kind of grooves a little better. But I always felt that we rarely got it right in the studio. Sometimes live we'd get it right, but I was the band's biggest critic in some respects, in terms of our recorded material.
Did you at that stage kind of think, hang on, I could write songs?
I wrote bits. You know, I was married with 2 kids, and I had a piano at home, and we were working an awful lot. I mean, we were on the road an awful lot. But I do remember a few things that I'd written. Only bits, and one of those bits reared its head on Lily White Lilith on the Lamb, but not so much. No, it wasn't until, you know, the Great Sorrow of 1980, which produced, you know, Face Value, and you know, which produced me writing on my own. And then suddenly I realised I could do this. But before, my interest was much more in playing than writing, you know. And I had Brand X, although that was 73, 74, 75. Actually, it was probably through to the 80s, but it started about 73, 74. And that kind of that took up a lot of my time as well, playing. But that was the direction, my early jazz love, you know, of things like John Coltrane and Buddy Rich and Count Basie, led me to Weather Report and Stanley Clarke and Chick Corea and people like that. And so Brand X was an obvious, you know, I was asked to play in that band by by Island. They had this band they didn't know what to do with, and they needed a drummer, and I said, well, you know, I'm only in one other group, I can join a second one. So I did that, and I never went home, really. I used to stay for hours and just jam with Brand X, and then that kind of developed into instrumental band as opposed to being a kind of average white band type group with vocals. It went to, we got rid of the singer and went into much more of a jazz rock thing.
Sounds like that was sort of having fun and doing the thing that you loved more, maybe.
Yeah, that was really. I mean, at the time, you know, it's a little grey. I can't, you know, for example, I mean, Peter left the band after the Lamb, and I guess there was that year where we didn't really know what we were doing, but I was going to be the singer in the end. But there was still a side of me that wasn't necessarily getting fulfilled by Genesis, you know, the playing side of it, because we were a bit more structured. You know, we were writing, and we wrote out of improvisation, but once we wrote and we had something finished, we rarely deviated from that once it was written, whereas Brand X was different every time we played it. So that kind of appealed to me. But then I think Genesis started to get looser in the big picture, and Brand X started to get a little bit more restricted. Plus, I realised that my time just couldn't be split like it used to be. So I let Brand X go, and they got another drummer and carried on.
Well, talking about your time, you were touring all over the place and up and down the motorways, and I'm amazed that you managed to go off on another gig at all, let alone like run with another band.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, it was adventurous, but you know, I mean, I did go to America with Brand X. That was something that I always wanted to do with the band. So we did do like a short tour of America. And we still have lots of people, you know, lots of people that like Brand X. The place, my studio here in New York, the owner of the studio was a huge Brand X fan. You know, he's a drummer, and he was saying, oh, the stuff of Brand X is fantastic. You know, so I still find people that like it, but I mean, it was a bit of an acquired taste, some of the Brand X thing. You know, if you didn't, it was a guy's music as well. We took no prisoners. It was quite fun though. We used to go on stage with guns and tapes of sheep bleating and all kinds of stuff. You know, it was a bit like a very, very musical Bonzo Dog Doodah band.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah. We had arguments on stage between the two keyboard players who would fire guns, and it was kind of, and then we'd play some jazz. You know, why not?
Fantastic. The first American tour, maybe we should talk about that, because Nursery Crime had come out. I know that you did a little one-off concert here in New York, and then a few months later, this American tour started. What do you have any memories of that? I interviewed Ed Goodgold here the other day.
Did you really?
Fantastic, yeah.
Yeah. We've been in touch actually in the last couple of years, because I did the musical here for Disney, and I was spending a lot of time here, and for some reason I got an email from somebody, then I realised he was still alive. I didn't even know that he was still alive, and I did see him at the Going Back concerts. He came to the show, and he hadn't changed really at all, which is a long time ago. It's 40 years, and he didn't seem to have changed. He's always been bald and looked the same.
So I'll tell you a story that he told us. See what your reaction to this was. That when the tour started, he got you guys all together individually and told you all that you better behave yourselves and better be good boys. Do you remember that? And what?
Yeah. I mean, I've retold that story. I mean, what I remember him doing was was going up to us individually. We were staying at this Holiday Inn and that Holiday Inn or whatever, Howard Johnson's, and he would come up to us and he'd say, you know, you are the most important guy in this band. Don't ever forget that, right? You know, and he'd kind of butter you up, and he'd give you an amazing confidence that you were really the guy that mattered, you know. And of course he said it to everybody. And we all were going around thinking that we were each, you know, really the leader of the band. And it was kind of great psychology. But, and he lifted morale because, you know, we did a show here. This must have been prior. It was in December 1972. And I remember it distinctly because when I went back from that show, at Christmas, my dad died. And so he died before anything really. You know, I mean, I think he came to see the show in England at one of the pubs we played in, but he never really saw that it could go anywhere. So I've never forgotten that it was December '72, and we did the one show which was a showcase, but it was suggested that we do a warm-up show just to sort of get the feel of it. And so we went to Boston because Boston was renowned for liking English bands. We'd read it in Melody Maker, we'd read it in all the other music papers. You know, King Crimson had done very well here in Boston, and The Nice, and all these kind of bands that we felt we had something in common with. Well, we went, they organised a gig at Brandeis University in Boston, a lunchtime concert. And so, you know, you've got to remember that, you know, Peter was wearing his costumes and things. We didn't have any kind of show, but he had his outfits. And we were on some kind of stage that was obviously, you know, put up piece by piece. It wasn't in a big auditorium or anything. And it was a lunchtime concert where students came with their lunch boxes and their homework and sort of their papers to study with. And I remember there was about 50 people in the audience, maybe 50 people, and they were all eating or all reading, you know, and we were thinking, this can't be Boston. Is this the right Boston? They're supposed to like us here. You know, it was a disaster, really. And I think Ed was there. I don't remember when he started managing us, actually. But I think he was brought in by the record company at the time, which was Buddha. And Shanana may have had some, he was managing them, and they may have had some tie. So he was brought in as a kind of, this is another bunch of weirdos, you know, see if you can do something with them.
Yeah, I think he said that Strat asked him.
Okay.
Because he was involved with Buddha.
Yeah. So he was kind of managing us on the American side. And then we did the next night or the next night after that, we did some photographs in Central Park, which are still being used today. And then we did the Philharmonic Hall, which is now the Avery Fisher Hall, which is part of the Lincoln Center. And you know, we'd flown it out, and for some reason, what had worked in Boston did not work in New York. I mean, the Mellotron had terrible problems because it ran on cycles. And we didn't know that 50 cycles or 60 cycles here was different from English power. I don't know why this wasn't a problem in Boston, but it didn't seem to have been. But here, and the unions made it very difficult. You know, we had to be off the stage a certain time. And this was our most important show. You know, we thought if we do a good show here, we'd cracked America, you know. Little did we know that down the road, 150 miles, they hadn't heard of you. But anyway, the show, they loved the show. The audience loved the show. We hated it. I don't remember what I felt about it, but I could sense that Tony thought it was a complete disaster, Tony Banks. And it wasn't like Mike would say, oh no, well, we did all right. You know, he was thinking of the whole thing. If the Mellotron was out of tune and our big stuff didn't sound right, then it was a disaster. You know, I was playing in New York. I'm not sure what I felt. I thought, like, you know, if that doesn't sound good, listen to me. I'm playing some good shit. You know, I don't remember what I felt. But anyway, it was deemed a disaster. Except that it did put us on the map, and people now talk about the legendary show in 1972, where this, you know, young band Genesis came through and showed everybody the way. You know, I don't remember it like that, but of course we did think that because we'd gone down so well that was it for America, and then, you know, the penny slowly dropped that we had to. That was just one piece of the giant jigsaw. So we came back for another tour, which definitely Ed Goodgold was involved with, and Nancy Lewis, who was a publicist for Monty Python. I mean, it was the same time as Monty Python were on the Charisma label, and they were doing things over in America for the first time.
Do you think of joining together, Genesis and Monty Python?
Yeah, well, there was one party where we all. It was a party in honour of them and us here in New York. And, well, later in life, when I went to Strat, he was in LA and I went to Strat because I'd known him a long time. This was 1980. Face Value had yet to come out, and I wasn't going to sign my solo career with Charisma. I wasn't going to sign it with Strat. And I knew that he was kind of a bit surprised and shocked and saddened by that, because we'd known each other for a long time. And I went to visit him. I was in LA and he was in LA with Monty Python. They were doing the Hollywood Bowl. And I went to his room and showed him the record, or played him the record, and I said, you know, I'm not going to be signed. I'm going to be signing with Virgin in England and Atlantic in America. And he was a bit disappointed, you know, because we'd known each other such a long time. And then there's a knock on the door, and John Cleese walked in. I'm sorry, I didn't know you were busy, Strat. And he had this hockey shirt on. It was a very incongruous sort of picture of Cleese with this Penguins hockey shirt. I'll come back later. Anyway, so, you know, and then we played football, five-a-side football, with Python, Genesis against Python, which was Strat loved his football, and he tried to get a few five-a-side teams going to have a championship, and we played against Python, and we were terrible, but Python were very good. I mean, Cleese was a great football player. You know, he was like, you look at him and think, how could he possibly have ball control? He's such a gangly guy, but he had fantastic foot control. So yeah, we had a bit of cross-party stuff going on.
So back to the
yeah.
That's a good story though. Cleese is so the funny walks becomes a funny footballer.
Yeah.
Back to the American tour. When you set out across America, in fact, audiences hadn't really heard of you. Ed was saying it was the one tour where he went around lying to people, lying to DJs. These guys, they're great, you know. It's the imports. Everyone's listening to them from the imports.
Yeah.
But you presumably experienced a kind of unenthusiastic opening session, at least. Did it build? Can you remember that?
Well, yeah, it certainly. We learnt that. I mean, first of all we had to get gigs wherever they would give us gigs, places to play, and that was most of the time. I guess that would have been the traditional strongholds of English bands. Although we didn't go back to Boston for a while. Philadelphia was great. Chicago was great. We went to Los Angeles for the first time, played the Roxy. I think we did. We
yes.
certainly, yeah, I know we played there, but I don't know if we played there in the early days as well. Yeah, my memory tends to sort of be a bit hazy around this tour. I know that we had we had Shoko doing our sound and lights, and we started using a guy called Craig Schertz, who did our sound for quite a few years after that, and also a Shoko guy called Alan Owen, who did our lights for many tours after that. Both of them not with us anymore. We spent a lot of time rehearsing in Dallas, if I remember rightly, because that's where Shoko was based. But I can't remember the exact length of the tour. Probably about 3 or 4 weeks, I would have thought. Yeah. There's a very good book, Alan Hewitt, called The Musical Box, I think, or Opening the Musical Box, and it's got pretty much every show that we've ever played, you know, listed, solo and as a band. It's kind of, I don't have it here, but it's kind of an interesting book, because, you know, I look at it and think, fuck, did I play everywhere? It's like your life in a book. But it might be interesting, you know, at some point if you look at it.
Was this is your first time really you're on tour in America, English rock band. Did it kind of, how did it affect you? Did it go to your head? Was there a sort of, oh my God moment?
Well, I think we had, I mean, probably it was 1973. Well, it was definitely 1973 because the first shows were December of '72.
Yeah, yeah.
So, by that point, we'd been in Europe, and, you know, Belgium, particularly, Italy, particularly, maybe France. They'd taken to us. You know, we felt we were getting somewhere, you know, and we were quite popular in England, and we were branching out in Europe, and we had really strong support in Italy and Belgium, French part of Belgium particularly. So I think it kind of one part of it probably surprised us. So I think it might have hit us as quite a challenge, which you historically had to crack if you were going to, you know, make it in the business. So it was interesting. I mean, Tony and Mike, I think, and particularly kind of enjoyed the travelling part of it. You know, just seeing all these places that you up until that point had only heard about. So it was hard. I mean, even remember the hotels, you know, were a novelty.
Let's talk a bit about Peter, because the role of Peter, the singer, turning into in performance, the kind of the more theatrical side. What did you make of him when you first worked with him, and then what did you think of his stage stuff as it developed?
Well, I didn't feel anything negative about Peter's costumes really, and until maybe later. I'm just trying to think. I mean, in the early days of Aylesbury Friars and all those places, the costumes were kind of, you know, a hat. It wasn't like slippermen, you know what I mean? It was kind of small stuff. He had his bass drum, which was part of his equipment, and he could hide behind his bass drum. And I know how that feels, because, you know, when you're a drummer, you have this thing. It doesn't have to be a huge kit, just it's like between you and the audience, and it's a bit of cover, and it's a bit of a security blanket. And I think Peter wanted to keep his bass drum, because he was a drummer, for the moments where he wasn't actually singing. And there were quite a few moments, a lot of moments in Genesis music where there was no singing, there was no vocal. So that gave him something to do, plus the flute. And I kind of, you know, with the hat and the costumes as they started to become, gave him something to hide behind and become somebody else. You know, Peter was a very shy guy, and we had the example of Peter Sellers. You know, it was a great example of that. Who was on his own, was kind of shy, but when he became people, he was in his element. And I think that's probably true somewhat of Peter. I remember certain things like the Dublin concert when he first put on, when Foxtrot came out, and he came on with the fox's head and the dress. None of us knew about that. You know, the whole idea of nobody in the band knowing it was, and I sympathise with him on this. I mean, I've heard him interviewed, and he said any discussion with Genesis would have led to a compromise. Any discussion with Tony, Mike, Phil, you know, it would have resulted in a compromise with no one winning. So he just decided not to talk about it. And we were doing whatever song it was. I can't remember what song it was relevant to, but we were playing, and suddenly, you know, the audience went crazy. And on this boxing stadium in Dublin, he walks on stage with the dress on, with the fox's head. And I didn't think anything other than, yeah, okay, you know, why not? It was on the album cover. It was, I think that was probably before the, I don't remember whether it was before, I know it was put us on the front cover of Melody Maker. And, you know, the triangular box for Supper's Ready and the cloak, that also put us on the front cover of Melody Maker. And that was used in Supper's Ready. And it's, hey, babe, you know, with his white outfit. That may have even got us on the front cover of Melody Maker. You know, I mean, in a way, I wore my overalls and he wore his dress, you know. It was just stuff to go to work in, really. But later on, I think it got a little bit overdone. I mean, there was one humorous moment where we did the Theatre Royal Drury Lane 5 nights, which was kind of a big deal at the time. And we did Supper's Ready. I guess it was for one of the early stages of Supper's Ready, one of the early performances of it. And because of the staging and we could fly, you know, Peter decided to go up in the air. You know, he came on and did the Gods of Magog, you know, the Apocalypse in 9/8 in Supper's Ready with the black cape, and then took everything off. Hey babe, with your guardian eyes so blue. And he went up in the air with this completely in white satin outfit, you know, like the angel. Went up in the air, but of course what he hadn't bargained for was that the ropes, once he got up into the air, started to turn, you know. So he was starting to rotate with his back to the audience and desperately trying to sing, but kick his leg so that it would turn the momentum round so he would stay facing the audience. But I mean, I'm glad it wasn't me up there.
That must produce a great audience reaction. Did they, presumably, everyone just thought, oh, it's all part of Genesis, and this is the kind of thing they do?
Yeah, I guess, you know, I mean, I think, I don't know whether anybody realised, good guy, you know, of course he's turning around because the cables, you know. I think they just thought that it was such a great, you know, the originality of the thing bought us the time, you know, and no one, you know, it wasn't like a theatrical, humorous moment. We thought it was funny because we were in the band, you know. We had moments with the Lamb where a similar thing would happen at the end of the Lamb. Before It, the song It, Peter would disappear and he would appear on one side of the stage, and a dummy would appear dressed exactly the same on the other side of the stage, and a strobe light would go on, so you didn't know which was Peter. I think that was this part. Was that? No, I'll tell you what it was. It wasn't for the Lamb. It was the same part of Supper's Ready, I think. And it's, boom, hey babe. We used to have, you know, an explosion, a little bit of an explosion, and a flash. And you had to mix exactly the right amount of explosive powder and flash powder. And we were in Europe, I think somewhere like, probably, it was the beginning of a European tour, it was probably somewhere like Oslo. And because we always kind of crept in the quiet places. And our production manager, literally, we'd done the Lamb, I think maybe that's what it was. We'd performed the whole of the Lamb, and then we were doing the encores or something, and this, he detonated, and it's, well, the thing was exploded. I mean, the speakers that the powder was sitting on exploded. Bits of wood hurling all across the, bits of wood hitting us, and the audience were just stunned. We stopped playing because we thought something had blown up, and it had, and the tour manager, the production manager, put his head round the curtain and said, sorry, literally just that. And I remember shouting to him, he said, "You're fired." And the audience, we stopped playing, and the audience just quietly got up and left. So we never finished the song. It was just one of those, they thought that was the end, because basically we couldn't probably play after that because ears were ringing, and there was, the speakers that these things were sitting on had blown up. There were lots of humorous moments, Spinal Tap moments. With the bit with the end of the Lamb, with the two dummies, the Peter and the dummy, the last night of the tour in Vancouver, one of our roadies dressed up. He put the leather jacket on but took all the rest of his clothes off and just stood there behind me, because I was on that side of the stage, like in the same position as Peter, with a leather jacket and nothing else. And I don't even know if people understood it, but it was like one of those last night pranks, End of Supper's Ready, we had strippers on stage. All crew jokes, they thought this would be funny. It kind of was funny for a few seconds, but then we had about, 5 minutes of music to play. And there's these three strippers on this very, for Genesis fans, which was very, it's like the Holy Grail, And there's three strippers taking their clothes off slowly. And they smell as well, BO, and we're all sort of sitting there wondering what to do. Do you look at the stripper? I mean, Peter was trying to sing, but there were strippers all over him.
Hilarious.
Yeah, kind of.
Imagine the sort of studious student of music.
Yeah.
Suddenly,
and
this is a lot more fun than...
Right, they don't know it's the last night of the tour. They just think that this is what we're now doing with Supper's Ready. Things change on tour, they morph into something else, Now we've got live strippers. So.
I was watching last night, I think, actually, one of the old concert, Peter on stage, Supper's Ready, and it's quite interesting because you're, at that point, I think you're in a white kind of boiler suit. And,
boiler suit, yeah.
Yeah. And you're quite clean shaven. You're not in the hippie sort of the longer hair and the hippie jacket and that sort of thing anymore. Mm-hmm. But Peter tells these little stories in between, which is kind of amuses the audience, and it takes you into the song. So into Supper's Ready, it tells a story about the worms, and it's a sort of mess. It's time for supper. Yeah. I was thinking, you're sitting there. You're very patient, and then you kind of. But there's an urgency to the way you're sitting. And I'm thinking, you're just dying to play those drums. Just get on with it, Peter. And my thought was, well, after doing that, say 100 times, you're the drummer. Let's have some music. And I wondered whether that was kind of, part of some of the tension that might be running through the band at that point. It's like, okay, this great stuff, yeah, but as you say, very Spinal Tap-ish half the time, and then where's the music?
Yeah, well, I don't remember thinking that. I mean, and if I did think that, I would own up and say it. I mean, the tension. I don't remember any tension, actually. I mean, I may have been oblivious to it. In the early days, I think probably towards the end of the Lamb, when we knew Peter was going to be leaving, there would have been tension, because I think at that point, you know, we felt, you know, this is the band, you know. I mean, this is, I mean, it's been caricatured in the Blues Brothers and Spinal Tap, you know. And for a long time, I have felt, you know, I was on the verge of leaving sometimes, whether it's because of the music isn't necessarily, you know, not because you've had some success on your own, but you think, well, the truth is that my music tastes, my music that I write is a lot simpler than Genesis stuff. I mean, for a while it was good to have both. You know, why not? I mean, I did Brand X and Genesis, and I could do my solo career in Genesis, and that's actually what I did. You know, I've turned down the opportunity of doing things more permanent. I mean, whether it's been to play with Eric Clapton, you know, on a more permanent basis in the days when I was playing with him. The Who, you know, I could have made a big, much more of a concerted effort to join The Who after Keith Moon died, and they'd already had Kenny Jones, but I always felt that I was the man for the job, frankly. But you know, I kind of didn't want to let the band down, because as soon as, you know, you're not only affecting the guys in the band, you're affecting the road crew, you're affecting people that have been with you for a long, long time. And when I did finally leave, I remember thinking, God, you know, what's going to happen to so-and-so? What's going to happen to so-and-so? But it came to the point where I was actually living in Switzerland, or going to move to Switzerland, and it became very impractical to just stay in the band and do all the things that we used to do. So going back to Peter leaving, one felt that why, you know, this is all working so well, you know, why do we have to go through this potential, you know, danger area of the singer of all people leaving the band? I mean, of course, I don't think any of us, maybe Tony Banks knew, but I certainly didn't. I didn't know anything about the problems with Jill, Jill Gabriel's childbirth problems, you know, and how that was all hanging in the balance. None of us knew that. I say maybe Tony Banks did, because Tony and Pete were very, very close. I didn't know that. I just thought that he'd been offered something from William Friedkin and fancied it, you know. Anyway, I think we all knew that when that came down and he left for that brief period during the writing of The Lamb, I think we all thought, okay, well, this could happen again at any moment. And when he came back, probably things were never the same. I don't really remember in detail. That's kind of a profound thing to say, and I would not like to say it was never the same again, or we just went on. You know, I remember us carrying on, but how people felt about it, I don't know. And I think, you know, probably people will be hanging on whatever we say about this. Has been, okay, well, we've heard from Phil and we've heard from so-and-so that things were never the same when Peter. Well, I don't remember, frankly. I do remember that we carried on writing The Lamb and we were very pleased with it, and then we went on the road, all the 3 images on the screens and stuff. You know, sometimes it was, you know, one image was with the wrong other 2, and, you know, if we got it right, or the guys got it right, or the projectors worked, it was interesting, you know, but sometimes, most of the time, it didn't happen like that. So tension-wise, there wouldn't have been with me, other than the fact that with some of the costumes, I was always a music guy, and I think we all started to get a little bit ratty with the way we were reviewed. it's always a lot easier to talk about what the thing looked like and than to talk about the music, you know, especially with Peter's costumes. That's why his picture was on the front of the Melody Maker, and we all understood that was the thing that was visually interesting, and it was more difficult to talk about the music. And unless you got someone like Chris Welch, who worked for Melody Maker at the time, and you know, he was a very musical guy, but some of the other journalists would just concentrate on Peter, and it was like that was the show. And I think at that point we all started to think, probably not Peter, but possibly Peter as well. We all started to think, well, I wish it was a little bit more about the music as well as what costumes we were wearing. But some of the local guys would just come in and it would be like, oh, Peter, that hat you wore was just... The kids just loved that shit, you know. So it kind of, I guess it did start to rankle a bit. And especially as it went on, when you had something like in The Lamb, the microphone... I mean, Peter would probably say, oh, for fuck's sake, leave that alone, you know. But for me, I was sitting there watching. A lot of the time, the microphone, he couldn't get the microphone near his face because, you know, of what he was wearing. The Slipperman outfit was one in particular. And the lamia, which came down, which was a kind of, I don't know what you call it, a kind of a cone, a conical thing, which he sang in the middle of, which rotated. And sometimes, you know, the microphone cable would get caught on the thing that was rotating, and he'd be, you know, and I know if you're trying to do something and you're going up and down, you're trying to, yes, you know, the singing will get affected, you know. And that's at that point I thought maybe we've gone too far with this, you know. In the end, you know, I mean, I admire Pete for doing it because, you know, it takes an awful lot to stand there in the stuff and sing and to act it out. I just thought that the music was taking second place, if not third place. So that's when there was a little bit of tension, but never. I don't remember ever feeling bad towards Peter. I just felt it was an animal that was getting out of control.
Was it a relief in some ways when Pete said he was going to leave? I mean, like...
I've heard it was. I don't remember thinking it was a relief. You know, I mean, I've always, you know, I know it sounds like Ron Decline in the Blues Brothers, but I've always loved Pete. I love you like you're my family. Peter, you know, and we're all great pals, you know. I mean, I'm in touch with Peter now, and for a while it was Phil against Pete and Pete against Phil. You know, it's never been that way. But you know, and some have even suggested that I was very pleased when he left. You know, the last thing. I mean, Pete's not only a great singer and a great writer. You know, he's a great person to have around. He was fun. You know, him and I were kind of soul buddies, really, because we were both drummers. And some of the time, you know, we laughed a lot. The last show was due to be Toulouse in France, but that got cancelled due to lack of interest. So suddenly, you know, I think it was the day of the Besançon show, Tony Smith came up and said that the show tomorrow is cancelled. So this is the last show. And it was kind of a very quick decision. No one had prepared, if you like. And I remember Peter playing the last post in the dressing room on his oboe, you know, and we went out and did it. I don't remember how that felt. But it was obviously, you know, as much, if there was relief, it was as much sadness as relief. You know, this was something that we'd, you know, I know it was only 5 years, but this was longer than some bands existed, you know. So it was a shame that it had to happen.
So Pete leaves. I'm not really meaning to go through this sort of chronologically, but it does seem it's quite useful in a way, because it's kind of taking us into issues. So the thing about you as the singer, it's always struck me that with Genesis in the early part, there are these one or two places where you sing, and there's obviously More Fool Me is a really good example. And when you hear it in the middle of England, selling England by the pound, it sort of feels like a breath of fresh air, and it's like, there's a Phil Collins single, you know. And it's a love song, and it's kind of wistful, and it's got emotion in it. Yeah. And it's not a big story, not that those aren't great, but it's almost like a coda, you know, it's like...
Yes, it's almost like the Harpo Marx bit in Marx Brothers film. Actually, just occurred to me as you were saying that. I mean, it's like the little guy comes out from behind the drums and sings a song. It was a bit... I didn't write that song, you know. Well, Mike wrote the music. Maybe I wrote the words. I don't remember.
That's
Maybe
what I wanted to ask you, because it's credited to both of you.
Is it? Both of us? It's credited to both.
Well, it's credited to all Genesis. Actually.
Yes, that's right. Yes, because that's the way we did
like
things.
Songwriter. If you go on some obscure sites.
Yeah, Well, I think most people assume that I wrote it because I sang it, which is the same way that they thought Pete wrote everything because he sang it. You know, that's where these things go wrong, because quite often we're singing other people's lyrics. You know, me and Pete. So. More For Me, let's assume that, I know it was a song of Mike's, and I think probably, I remember writing it with him, or going over it and singing it with him in the staircase at Island Records, where we were doing The Lamb, where we were doing Selling England. We recorded it, and we did Foxtrot as well. We did a lot of stuff in what was then Basing Street Studios at Island, which later became Psalm with Trevor Horn. But yeah, it was a great moment in the show, because it was a bit of a breath of fresh air from the intense stuff that we were doing, and I was somewhat Peter Stooge, you know. I mean, the one-handed drum solo, for example, was always a funny moment, where if we had a problem, if we had a breakdown, I would start and just play that, and Peter would say, and here we have the wonderfully incredible Phil Collins playing his one-handed drum solo, you know, and I'd just play that. And then he'd just have another couple of funny lines, and you know, and then when everything was fixed, we'd just stop and take a bow, and you know, and a lot of the time we bounced off each other, and that was that you know, it only solidifies the idea that we were great pals. But More For Me on the album, we put it on the same as For Absent Friends, I think, is on Nursery Crime, as being that was me and Steve. I forgot where we were going with that.
I was wondering what, at some point, I have the sense that the idea of being the singer-songwriter kind of clicked with you, and I kind of felt maybe it was forming with something like More For Me, that it's like the beginnings of, you know, this is something I like doing, and I'm pretty good at it, because your voice on More For Me is terrific.
Oh, I haven't heard it, but well, I can only say that I was singing lead vocal as well. We had a singer in my school group, but I also sang lots of songs from the drums. So being a singer was never, it didn't begin with my work with Genesis. You know, I was kind of singing. I remember sitting down with the drummer, who was one of our teachers at the drama school, that went on to become the drummer with Joe Cocker at Woodstock, you know, the Grease Band's drummer, Bruce Rowland, and he was a great guy, and he played with Fairport Convention as well. And I remember doing a demo with my band, or with an early version of Flaming Youth, and he said, "Man, you should sing." I was singing on this song, And he said, "You should sing. I know you're a good drummer, but you should sing. You sound a bit like Steve Winwood." And I said, "Well, great, because I love Steve Winwood, but I mean, I'm a drummer. I don't want to be singing." But I remember him really urging me to do that. And I did it. I was always the second voice. We did stacked harmonies in the studio, but certainly with the Lamb, most of those harmonies were me. And when we sang live with Genesis, I was always really the only other voice. With I Know What I Like, that was me and Pete as a duet. I did all the backing vocals. Sorry, I did all the backing vocals on the other stuff live. So kind of, I wasn't actually finding myself. This was another asset that I brought to the band, but I never thought that the singer would leave, And it wasn't until my first wife, up to and out, that I started to write. As I mentioned before, I wrote odd bits, but never really occurred to me that I was a writer. And I certainly didn't want to relinquish the drum stool to be the singer. And
how did that come about, being the singer?
Well, we go back to Acton, and the same shop that I learnt to play drums, I learnt to read music, drum music, was Maurice Plaquet's. He was a great drummer himself, and he had a music shop in Woodfield Road, Acton, and I knew him, and we were looking for a place to rehearse. That was always a problem in those days, trying to find somewhere to rehearse that wasn't an arm and a leg, and also kind of, had a good vibe to it. But he had a spot in the music shop that we used. Am I right? No, I don't think I'm right.
I think
it was Una Billings,
right.
Shepherd's Bush. There was, yes, on Shepherd's Bush Road, I think, there was a dance. I was using it. I don't know how I found it, but I'd used it with Brand X, and we'd used it on Selling England. I can picture the room. I can't picture the place.
I think it was the Una Billings place, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was a dance studio, or
well, there's a picture of me and Peter sitting on during the course of that was Selling England, but this room that we rehearsed, I'm pretty sure it was. Sorry to fuck you about, but I'm pretty sure that it was Woodfield Road, Acton, because I could picture the room, and the four of us, we decided with Peter that we wouldn't let anybody know anything, and in those days, pre-internet, it was possible to keep things a secret. So we started writing what was to become an album, and during the course of writing, we were auditioning singers. That's what we decided to do. And so every Monday or so, we'd have, first of all, the advert was in Melody Maker, and everybody that wanted to join sent tapes to the office, who then weeded them out of the jokes. There was obviously people singing along to Frank Sinatra. Some of the things that weren't going to make it were put aside, and the ones that sounded like they could almost make it were given to us. So we listened to them, and then they, we'd invite these people down, 4 or 5 at a time, every Monday, while we continued to write during the rest of the week. What was to become a Trick of the Tail. So the guys would come down, and the way it was that I would, being the only other singer in the band, this 4-piece band of Steve, Tony, Mike and me, I would sing them the piece we were going to teach them, and then they would get an opportunity to sing the thing with us playing. No, I mean, it's tricky, you know, because some of the Genesis melodies go all over the place and they're not exactly regular, straight ahead things to learn. But nevertheless, you know, that's what we did. And we eventually, long story short, we eventually got down to 2 or 3 people that we thought might be on the short list. So one day we had those guys down. All the time we were writing this material, which was turning out to be quite good. And we never had the opportunity to sing while we were writing this stuff. We knew that there would be vocal melodies, but because I was drumming, there was no voice to be heard. We just knew there would be a singer at some point. And obviously it wasn't going to be me because I was the drummer. So we had one guy, we eventually whittled it down to one guy called John, and I can't even remember his last name. But by this point the story had leaked. So one day we woke up, and that's why I know it was Woodfield Road, because I remember my heart being in my mouth when I opened a copy of Melody Maker. Well, I bought it, and on the front page was the picture with the box, you know, the cloak, supper's ready, saying Gabriel quits Genesis. And so suddenly it was kind of writing an obituary of the band. And, you know, it was kind of frustrating because we kind of had some good material and we were going to carry on, but that was going to take X amount of time before we recorded it and mixed it and got it out. Meanwhile, people were thinking of us in the past tense. So anyway, we booked Trident Studios. We went into Trident, we recorded the backing tracks, and we got our singer that we thought might make it down to sing at an early stage, to sing along. The first thing he did was sing along to Squonk, which was as a backing track at that time. And so he sang, and the poor guy, you know, the song was too high for him. He couldn't sing. He was probably nervous. It was not in the right key. You know, it was it would have been nervous. I mean, we were a well-known band, and this guy was coming in, and suddenly he had to sing this song that he'd only just learned. You know, it was terrible, really, to put a guy through that. Anyway, it didn't sound very good, and we all looked at each other and thought, okay, this is not going to happen, I don't think. So we thanked him and we said we'd let him know, which we presumably did. Now, after he left, I said, you know, I think I'd like a go at this. Now, I was always down to sing a couple of the softer songs because of my track record with things like More Fool Me. You know, I had the soft voice in the band, but I thought I could do a bit more than that, so I said, let me have a go, you know. I mean, I think my first wife had said to me, why don't you do it? But I didn't take her seriously, frankly, you know, and I didn't want to relinquish the drum chair, which I knew that was inevitable. You know, that was kind of an inevitability if I had to sing. So anyway, I went down to the control room and I sang Squonk, you know, and I went up to listen to it, and the guy said, this sounds all right, actually. So let's persevere. So I went down, I sang it a few more times, and we got what we thought was good, and then we went to another song, and like in the next few days, we got the rest of them out of the way. And suddenly we finished the record, but we still didn't have a singer. You know, we'd done one job, but we hadn't really sorted the problem out. So suddenly it was a question of do this or we don't do the touring. So we sat around, and I guess, you know, we talked about it, and I said, well, okay, if we get a drummer that I like, I guess it's possible. I mean, I'd probably gained confidence doing the record that I could do the job, you know, but I just didn't fancy myself standing in front of a crowd as the lead singer. You know, Peter had his costumes, but I wasn't going to go there, even though I was the one with the acting career, if you like, the acting background, and probably been the one that actually could have carried it off. That's not what I wanted to do, because this was music. This wasn't that. So I said, I have to do it my way, you know. I don't want to just do the costumes thing. And we all agreed that that would be the right way to do it anyway. So, you know, I said I started to look out for a drummer. Now, I was working with my other band, Brand X, at Unibillings, And I remember Bill Bruford. But yeah, we were probably at Uni Billings because the other place had the Genesis equipment in it. So I was working with Brand X down there, and Bill said to me, because he was Bill Bruford from Yes, and I were great friends at that point, and he was playing percussion with Brand X. You know, it was kind of one of those things where people came and went. And he said, "What's happening with the Genesis thing?" And I said, "Looks like I'm going to be the singer." I said, "But I've got to find a drummer." And he said, "Well, why don't you ask me? You know, I'm not doing anything." I said, "Well, I didn't think you'd want to do it, having been in Yes." You know, this was before he went into King Crimson and Asia and all that, you know. And Genesis and Yes had some kind of crossover fans because we were both progressive rock, if you like. But he said, "Yeah, I'd do it. I'd love to do it." So I went to the other guys and said, "Listen, Bill Bruford will do it if that meets everybody's approval," and it did. So we started rehearsing with Bill with me out front. And we rehearsed, and you know, the first shows, I remember the very first show in London, Ontario, in Canada, which would have been 1976, I would have thought. The album was 1975, I think this was 1976. And, you know, I was worrying about what I was going to wear. You know, I remember on the way to the show being very nervous, wondering what I was going to say. I knew that I could sing. That wasn't really an issue to me. I knew that it wasn't so frightening for me once the music started. It was when the music stopped that I was worried, because Peter had the stories and people looked at him as a mysterious traveller. You know, tell us, Peter, what should we be thinking? You know, it's like Monty Python, Holy Life of Brian. You know, fuck off. How should we fuck off? It was like, and so anyway, I wrote these stories out. People said I sounded like Pete. Well, the only reason I could think of was the melodies were written melodies, so you sang the melody. You know, some people would think that that was the melody that Peter had made up, but these were the melodies that were written with the composition of the thing, so therefore I was singing the same melody. That would have sounded somewhat like Peter. Our range may have sounded something similar. And also my voice had been on all the records. You know, I'd been the backing vocals on The Lamb. I'd done duets. I'd done my own individual vocals. You know, my voice was a familiar thing. So I think that's why people thought that we sounded alike. But as the show went on, you know, I got more confident that first show. The only thing I did put on a hat and a coat for was robbery, assault and battery, because that was a kind of an Artful Dodger moment in the show, and I felt I could do that without feeling like it's someone else's shoes. So I did that, but otherwise it was all just me and a microphone stand. And it took me years, absolutely years, to take the microphone off a stand. That became my drum kit. That became my security blanket between me and the audience. You know, eventually I got confident enough to walk around with a handheld mic, which if you'd have told me I'd ever be doing that back in '76, I'd have said, no, you're crazy. I'll never have the confidence to do that. But suddenly, you know, I became the singer, and I always kept the drum kit on stage because there was always lots of moments with the older material and even some of the new material at that point where I was playing drums. You know, when I went back to the drums, Chester stopped, which was great. It was interesting visually, you know.
So when you said Chester, but the first gigs were with Bill.
With Bill, yes. Sorry, that was my mistake. Yeah, you certainly. I mean, up until Bill did one tour of us. He did the Trick of the Tail tour, and then he had enough. We had that effect on people. No, he wanted to be part of the music. He was, you know, his job in Genesis was to play what I played, you know, and he brought something else to it as well. But he didn't like playing the same thing every night, you know. And I was a pretty, you know, hard taskmaster, I suppose. You know, certain things were written. Although I had the most freedom in the band to play the way I wanted to play, there were certain things that were kind of, you know, weren't negotiable. And I think he probably found that a little frustrating. So eventually, and he left and formed Asia, you know, or UK, I think it was. He went on to form UK and then Asia. I don't even remember if he was in Asia. Forget about that. He was in UK, you know. It all blurs. It's amazing I can remember what I do. Anyway, he left, and then we had another, you know, now we had another problem.
But just wondering, in those very first concerts, you're not the drummer, you're the singer, with occasional journeys back to the drums. Mm-hmm. How did it feel, I mean, just emotionally, like you're giving up a part of you when Bill was playing instead of you?
Well, it was a big deal for me, because I was suddenly hearing the band from a different position on the stage. You know, when you're behind a drum kit, if you're a drummer, when you're behind a drum kit, that's the machine room, that's the engine room, that's, you know, you're hearing it with the drums louder than anything else, although you can hear everything. I mean, that's what you've got monitors for, and you can get a balance that sounds great, but the drums are kind of driving it. Suddenly you're out front and you're not hearing it in the same way anymore. You're hearing the drums from 12 feet away, 15 feet away, and you're hearing the band in a different position. You've now got to pay much more attention to the singing, because you've got to hear yourself to be in tune. And, you know, I mean, when I was doing the Lamb, for example, when I was still back on the drums, I used to wear headphones to make sure I could hear everything, and it was fantastic. I mean, it was like I was playing along to a live record. It was a great experience doing that. Suddenly, the next tour, I'm out the front. So it really did make a big difference from wearing those headphones to not, you know, before I had the in-ear monitors, which I more recently used. So emotionally, I always felt great, because I wasn't a singer. I was a singer that played the drums. You know, it's a bit like, that made it okay, you know. So I just got to tell you this John Cleese, there was a famous sketch, and the accountant sketch, you know, of the Python, where I said, I want a job. He said, but, you know, what is your qualifications? Well, you know, and he said, I'm sorry, you're boring, you're sort of got no ambition, and so you're perfectly qualified to be an accountant, right? And then there was an interview with John Cleese saying, well, I suddenly realised after that sketch that I was meeting my accountant the next day. And I thought, my God, if he saw the show, I insulted him. So he said, he met his accountant. He said, hi, how you doing, John? He said, very good. Listen, did you see the show last night? And he said, yes, I did. He said, oh, I'm sorry, ever so sorry about that sketch. You know, the accountant sketch, you know, I only wrote half of it, and it, you know, it wasn't meant to be enough. He said, I wasn't offended. I'm a chartered accountant. So it was a bit like me being a singer, you know, and a drummer. I wasn't just a singer that wiggled his ass in front of the audience. I was a drummer, so I was still cool, you know. So that gave me a lot of pleasure, because I suddenly felt like I hadn't demoted myself to being the singer. I was now in charge of 2 houses, and that, you know, I must admit, one of the reasons why I actually warmed to the idea of singing was the fact that the buck stopped here. You know, I was just going to stand there and sing, as opposed to have all this stuff on. And I know that sounds anti-Pete, but it's not meant to be. It's down to the circumstances that we found ourselves in. Peter, we were, you know, he had followed his path, which had involved more costumes and more visual aids and more ways of getting the lyrics across in a situation where sometimes the lyrics were inaudible, you know, and I wanted to bring us back to this is what you should be hearing. You know, these are the lyrics you should be hearing, and this is the voice that should be singing them. You know.
Let's move ahead to 1980 and the songwriting and Duke and that whole period. So casting, I know this is stuff you've talked about ad nauseam probably, Phil, but casting your mind back to that time, there's a kind of sense in which it's kind of a shift that Genesis had to make in a way, like it's the, you know, punk has arrived, the prog rock decline was obvious, and you, with maybe not consciously, kind of managed to steer the band towards a more songwriting, short songs, songs that were very melodic, that had some emotion in them, that, you know.
Yeah.
What's your take on all that?
Well, you know, sometimes one of the other guys in the band will say something, and you think, well, that's actually, I never thought of that, but that was true. I think Mike said that we were away for an awful lot of the punk thing. I mean, 77, 78, we were on tour an awful lot. And although I was still got my 3-4 music papers delivered, you know, to the house, I wasn't there to read them a lot of the time, I guess, because we were in America or going around Europe. So the punk thing, even though I was aware of it, it didn't seem to actually have a, you know, we weren't there in the trenches, you know, avoiding shell fire and things. It was, you know, I remember seeing the Pistols on So It Goes, was it? The Manchester show. One of their first television appearances, and I thought, wow, what's that? Because I always did give Genesis a bit of a hard time myself. I kind of saw what they were talking about, you know. I was a big early Yes fan, less so, even though I liked the guys in the band. I didn't relate to a lot of their music after the first 2 or 3 albums, you know. I mean, the Yes album was great, but I didn't really, after that, go for too much of it. Jethro Tull, ELP, not for me. Musically, Floyd, I was never a big Floyd fan. I've probably become more of a Floyd fan in later years than I was at the time. Even though I saw them at the Marquee with Arnold Lane, you know, I was aware of what they were doing, but I was never really a fan. I just, I was in a band that was kind of being always put in the same box as that lot, but never felt that we actually were in the same box. But we probably were. So I didn't really feel too bothered by punk. I kind of didn't like the way people sang deliberately out of tune and deliberately detuned their instruments, you know, or untuned them. I kind of felt there was a bit of cheating going on, you know. It was a fashion thing, and I thought it should be treated as that. It was obviously, you know, out of that kind of noise, although I don't think the Pistols were noise. As I said, I think the Pistols were a great band, and I actually did meet Johnny Lydon at a Mojo Awards show, and I went up to him and I said, I just got to say hello to you because I think you're great, you know. And he said, Phil, what a pleasure. You know, and I don't think he was taking the piss. I got a picture that's in my studio at home, you know, of me and him together. It's one of those things where he's a clever guy, you know, clever guy. I've met Rat Scabies, you know, and we were going to go out to dinner together. I met someone, I forget who it was, one of the Clash or the Damned, I don't remember, but there was someone at the airport once who came up to me and said, I'm a big fan, man, big fan. And I think this was the drummer, Topper Headon maybe. And you know, so drummers tend to transcend those kind of things. We've got our own little club, and we don't find it strange that we can actually say that we like someone even if they're the opposition. But you know, I didn't, you know, I couldn't tell you what a Clash record sounds like or a Damned record sounds like. I know the Pistols, but from all that stuff that, you know, came Elvis Costello and came the Police, and you know, punk got a little bit of melody. It kind of went through its own stages, and there was some good stuff that came out of it. But I don't think that it really affected me too much.
So you weren't really aware of all that particularly because you've been touring and you've been away.
Well, I was aware of it. I mean, and I think, on ABACAB we did a fantastic, I thought, song that was almost a tribute to punk. I mean, I don't know, we did it. I think Tony was playing around with his synthesizer, just going through different sounds by pressing the buttons, and the song just came together very, very quickly, and we kind of did it in one take. And I went away and wrote the lyrics, which was not kind of nonsense lyrics. And when we did it on stage, when the ABACAB album, when we did it, performed it live, got boos, you know, certainly in Europe. I mean, it's since turned out to be one of our most liked albums, I think. But there was some stuff on there that people just didn't like when we played it. I think we were that was the first post-punk album, and I think we had agreed that we should strip our sound down a bit and get a bit, you know, a bit more earthy and rhythmic. I think this probably coincided with us using Hugh Padgham as well. What was the album before ABACAB? Selling England, was it?
It was Duke and
Duke,
then
yes.
ABACAB.
Yes, yeah. So Duke, for the recording of Duke, which came slap bang in the middle of punk, I think, we were using Dave Henschel, who was a friend of mine and had produced Elton John, or engineered Elton John with us. He was a good guy, got on with everybody, and he was a great engineer, sort of co-producer. But for ABACAB, I was working with Hugh Padgham. I had worked with him on my things, and I suggested bringing him in because I thought he'd be great. Of course, the drum sound was bigger, which pleased me, but it also meant that it took up a lot more space in the sound, which gave us the opportunity to sort of think about how much layers we wanted to put on. You know, it became a little less orchestral, if you like, and that seemed to suit Tony down to the ground. You know, he didn't feel threatened by that. So that was a big change for us. It was probably prompted, I suppose, looking back at it, it was probably prompted by punk. But I think it was also down to us thinking our own future through, and thinking that, you know, we were changing as well. You know, people were changing, lifestyle was changing, and I think the music was just changing with it, natural thing. The Whodunit, which was the punk tribute, if you want to call it a tribute, was a bit of fun. And I think along with this change, I brought the horns section in. I was using the horns. I thought, well, why not Genesis with horns? Let's see what happens. And we did Paper Late, and we did No Reply, and me and Mike flew to LA to record the horns. And for me, it was like we could do anything, you know. I mean, you know, we weren't trapped by our own sound, if you like. I think the fans were a little trapped by it because they knew what they wanted and they didn't really like too much to deviate from that. So when we went, I remember being in Holland, in Leiden, which ironically is where my daughter's husband lives, or, you know, came from. I said that, you know, I remember the only time I've ever been to Leiden, apart from the wedding, was when Genesis played there and got booed. And you know, we started playing these songs and the audience booed, and it was always, at least it was a positive reaction, you know, in a negative way. The audience were being truthful, which so often with concert audiences, you know, it's all, you could, you know what's going to happen. You know, if this song's going to go down, great, this one's not, you know, then they're going to, even though they don't really know about, you know, the encore thing became a bit of a, you know, predictable kind of thing to go through. So to get an audience to do something honest was quite interesting, but not necessarily very pleasant to have at the end of a song.
Yeah, Duke was recorded actually at the end of '79, so it must have been '79 you're sitting in your house, and you come back from Vancouver and you start to write those songs. Can you tell us the story of that?
My natural instinct was to go and, you know, to save it. So I had a dinner with the guys, and which by this point was just Tony and Mike. You know, I think Steve had left during Seconds Out, or the mixing of Seconds Out. I had a dinner with them and said, listen, I'm going to leave, you know. I'm going to go to Vancouver, where my wife had gone with my 2 kids. I'm going to go to Vancouver to make things work. Now, I don't think we can exist with me living in Vancouver. So this, I guess, means I'm leaving. And Tony and Mike and Smith said, you know, well, we don't have to, let's just see how things pan out. Well, you have your time, whatever you need to do, and we'll go and make our solo albums. You know, we've got plenty of material. We've been wanting to do this. So Tony and Mike got on with their solo projects, and I went to Vancouver. Well, I spent a couple of months in Vancouver and nothing much changed. So I came back, and of course Tony and Mike were in the middle of their solo records by this point. And we'd all got, at the end of the Japanese tour, which was the last tour of '77, we'd all decided to get these little home studios, you know, very good equipment. I mean, 1-inch 8-track, which is what the Beatles recorded, you know, it was twice as much as what some of the Beatles stuff was recorded on, you know, I mean, it was like good quality stuff. So we'd all got these home studios to work and to sort of work up material on our own to bring into the band, as well as working on things for ourselves. So, as well as being given in Japan these drum machines, which I didn't actually want at first, because I probably had the same knee-jerk reaction as most drummers would do, so what do I need one for? But of course, when I started writing, that was when I realised I could use this machine. So just fooling around and recording it and trying to work out, you know, how to record things, because I'd never been in charge of a desk before or a tape machine. And, you know, things started to come together. I got the drum machine and I'd start to program that a little bit. And I think Tony Smith called me every now and again, you know, just to sort of say, how am I doing, what's going on? And I say, I've been writing some songs. And eventually, I remember him, I guess it was with Brand X, because in that period I also did some touring with the American tour with Brand X, and probably even a bit of recording with them. And we were rehearsing at the Una Billings dance studio in Shepherd's Bush, and he came down to say hi. And I said, I've been working on this. I had a cassette of my material, and we sat out in my Mini, and I played him it, and he said, this sounds good. This could be an album, you know. I said, oh, I couldn't face re-recording it again, but I mean, well, there's no reason why not. You know, I've got enough material. Maybe we could use my demos as the basic tracks instead of re-recording it. And I had worked with Peter Gabriel on his 3rd album, and, you know, I mean, I'd been pretty busy in my time alone. So I'd met Hugh Padgham, and I thought maybe he would be interested. I was sent as the group delegate when Arne Ertegen visited London to meet up with us, amongst other things that he was going to do. I was voted the group delegate to go and play him the Duke album, which we by this point had written and recorded in my house, with the fact that there was nobody else there but me. And I had my studio next door to the master bedroom, where we got rid of all the stuff and moved Genesis in, and we wrote Turn It On Again, and we wrote Duchess, and we wrote the Duke album. And I went into London to play Armit, who I knew and was very close to. I was the closest probably out of any of the guys in the band, because I tended to sort of socialise more with him than they did. And he liked it, and we had a couple of drinks, and he said, well, what about you? Are you all right? Because, you know, they all kind of were worried about me with the divorce. And I said, oh, yeah, I've been writing. And he said, what have you been writing? I said, well, I've got a cassette. Just so happens there's something I prepared earlier. And he said, I'd love to hear it. So I played it to him. He said, oh, man, this is fantastic, man. He said, I'll do anything you need me to do to make this record work. I said, wow, it was a great thing for me to have that kind of vote of confidence, apart from anything else. And I said, well, you know, I'm working on the demos to get them. He said, who do you need to help? And I said, well, I've got a little list of my favourite people that I'd like to get on it. He said, anything you need. And that was great. And so between him and a guy called John Kolodner, who was with Atlantic then, but then went on to help form Geffen Records, when he was at Atlantic, he was great help. He just got everybody on my list. The only person I couldn't get was David Crosby, who had his own problems at the time, but who later became a great friend of mine, and said, you wouldn't have liked me much at that time. I was in need of help. But I got everybody else. I got the Earth, Wind and Fire guys. You know, I got Alphonso Johnson. I got Stephen Bishop. I got Arif Mardin. I got the people I wanted to. I got Eric Clapton, who was a neighbour of mine in England, and we were drinking partners in Surrey, and where he lived and I lived, and he played on some of the record at my house. And he also came down to the studio to play. So it was kind of a bit of a magical time, really. You know, everybody seemed to like the material. I had, during the making of Duke, played the guys some of my demos, because we were looking. We had decided that, with everybody having by now the solo outlets, that we would keep our solo material for ourselves and really just write with Genesis, which gave Genesis a reason to exist. So I played them some stuff of mine, and they chose a couple of songs that they liked. Please Don't Ask was one, which was a very personal song, which I was surprised that they liked, and Misunderstanding.
So to clarify, they had kind of first choice, like anything that I've done here, it's on these cassettes. You guys have the first, for Genesis. Genesis can take the pick. The rest I'll do for my solo.
Yes, I don't remember holding anything back. I mean, there was a point where I may have played them the kind of things that I thought they'd be more interested in. But anyway, they chose a couple of songs.
And Please Don't Ask, as you say, it's an incredibly personal song. It's a pretty moving song. Did it, at that time, seem to kind of be... Did it seem to fit Genesis as it was then? Or was it actually the beginning of taking Genesis into some more personal stuff?
Well, it's a good point. Certainly, we had only just started to say "I love you" in a song, "Follow You, Follow Me." You know, that was really, and that was a Mike Rutherford lyric and a group tune. So it was the early days of letting our emotions be felt and heard. I felt it's kind of stood out a little bit on Duke as being a sort of not quite a Genesis thing, because it was so personal. It was probably the most personal song I'd ever written at that point, and here we are doing it in a Genesis session, but then Genesis really, was the three of us and our output, whatever songs we wrote. So if that's what I was writing, then it's fair enough for it to be included, But it's not what Genesis music was at that point. It didn't really fit in necessarily with what we were, what we were recording and writing.
Just another thought, because when you talked about doing the solo record and preparing that, the feeling that you get is that you can do anything. Well, essentially, is your record.
Yeah.
You're essentially almost like you're the producer, you're the author of this record.
Yeah.
Get what you make it as you want it, using the guys you want to choose from all over the world. Mm. Whereas with the Genesis, you're kind of set within this framework.
Yeah.
Not saying that it's just different. So
I agree, and this we go back to territory. All the things that I write on the piano, and the territorial stuff with Genesis is that Mike handles guitar and bass, and Tony handles all the keyboards, and I handle all the drums. Ironically, there are certain things, like Mama, for example, which is slightly later, but that drum machine thing, which that whole song is based on, was a Mike Rutherford drum machine pattern. Me and Sarah Jane, which was, I think, on Duke, it was on APARTMENT.IT, was a Tony Banks drum machine pattern. So it didn't actually turn out that, because we all had these tools at home, whatever the song was kind of, whatever got us motivated would be used in the end. But if I wanted to play piano on Please Don't Ask, that was not going to happen, because once I'd given it to the band, that became Tony's territory. And we had this issue before, which I've mentioned at other times, where Peter, who also wrote on the piano when he was in the band, would come in and wouldn't be able to play his piece that he'd written on the piano because Tony was the keyboard player. And, we had this moment on I Know What I Like when the making of that record, when someone may have been in the studio with somebody else not being there, but the idea was good. So we had the situation where Peter played a line on the mellotron at the end of I Know What I Like, and Tony, when he came in and heard it, said, "What is that?" And me and Peter, who had been there, said, "Oh, it's a mellotron. It's an idea that Peter had for the end of the fade of I Know What I Like." And he said, "Well, what are you doing playing my keyboards? It's my keyboards, and I'll play it." I think we ended up using Peter's version of it, which was only da 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 da. But it was very territorial at that point. So at that point, even now, if we did a Genesis thing, I wouldn't be allowed to play the piano. It would be Tony. He's the keyboard player. That's why, if you want to play the piano on your stuff, you keep it for your solo record. Which was what was funny about Please Don't Ask, was that song I had a very complete demo, which sounded basically like the Genesis version. To the point where apart from the sonic quality of the tape, like whether I could hear the hiss, and I couldn't tell you. Our version was identical to my version, except there was some guitar on the Genesis version, which Mike did. But it was, it was a very personal song. Misunderstanding, you know, was voted by the record company to be the first Genesis single from that album. And that was our second. I mean, Follow You, Follow Me being the first. It was our second hit record in the States. So my solo album, you know, would have been very strong with either of those songs on.
And clearly the solo album's a huge, maybe unexpected, massive hit, right?
Yeah.
It clearly didn't, having those two songs on Duke didn't take it away from the solo album because it was an enormous hit. And
well, there was, you know, I had more than enough songs. So, you know, I mean, Against All Odds, unbelievably, was not on my first solo album either. That was another song that was left off because, you know, I mean, let's say left off. I mean, I would have put Misunderstanding on my record, and I would have put Please Don't Ask on my record, but I wasn't thinking of putting Against All Odds on my record. I didn't think it was good enough. In fact, it didn't fire me up. And of course, that's probably my biggest song ever, if you like. I mean, apart from In the Air Tonight. Against All Odds has been covered more often by other people, and it's, you know, it's what people think of when they think of me. So I clearly didn't know what I was talking about. I just put on things that I liked. I have to say that I'm flaking.
Yeah.
I'm flagging a bit.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
I don't want it to show.
I know. Well, I think we've done 3 hours.
Yeah, it's not showing. But obviously, this is more how you're feeling rather than how...
Well, I just realised how hungry I am.
Yeah, right. You know.
Actually, I didn't have any lunch or...
I mean,
We've done 3 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah,
right.
That's right, we've done 3 hours.
We're going to fill in on other things on another day.
Oh, but I know we're nowhere near complete.
Yeah.